cave dwellers, welcome to the cave for the fourth and final part of our Amiga build. And if you're new to this series, when I say Amiga build, I really mean build. We've built this up from the component level on a brand new system board with new components in a new case and with a very modern accelerator. If you haven't seen those, check the description and all the links to the previous episodes are there. If you have been following us, well, you'll notice we have not only a floppy disk in here now, but also a CD-ROM, and I'm pleased to say a working CD-ROM. Thanks to your help, and this is the advantage of releasing these in an episodic format, because it's thanks to your help in the comments section on the last video that we got this working, thanks to a very kind suggestion. So we're all up and running, but I tell you what, this thing really tried to break my will before we got to this stage. Let me explain to you the day I had with this while I was trying to prepare for this episode. So my goal today was to get the CD-ROM working and to showcase the system to you, to show it working. So I took the lid off, got to work on the CD-ROM, and the first thing that happened was I started getting some green screens. Now, that normally indicates a RAM problem, and sure enough, the RAM was just creeping out of these sockets. The turned pin nature of the sockets that I put in there for the RAM didn't quite fit properly with the RAM. They just sort of crept out every now and then, and I'd push it back in, and it'd be okay again, and then it would creep out. I had made a note to maybe hot glue it in, or even take the sockets out and solder it in to fix that problem, but yeah, I left it a bit too long. So it did it one too many times and the RAM stopped working. So first problem, I needed to replace that RAM board, so I salvaged some old RAM parts that I had around here and got that working again. Brilliant. While we've got the board out, I thought let's put the trapdoor expansion socket in and take us up to 2 meg of chip RAM. Let's fully load this. So to do that safely, let's take the Vampire out. Turn the board over so we don't damage the Vampire, and it turns out when I pulled the Vampire out, I also left a pin from the Vampire in the CPU socket, and I took this thing out really carefully, but the pin snapped off. And it turns out this is a fairly common problem with Vampire owners, and with hindsight, which is always a wonderful thing, it's recommended that you use a CPU relocator. So you put the Vampire in that, and then you put that in the CPU socket, and then worst case scenario is that you break the relocator pins and not the Vampire. So I had to repair the Vampire. I would put it in a relocator, but I had to take some pins off of my relocator that I had here to fix the Vampire. So that's why it's straight in the CPU socket again. So we got that working again, and then I slotted in the 2 meg chip RAM expansion, and guess what? Yeah, puff of smoke. I'm afraid I didn't get this on camera, but puff of smoke and that RAM board blew up. It's an old RAM board that I hadn't tested, so it was probably already broken, but yeah, that put an end to that idea. So I thought, okay, everything's working, everything's settled, apart from the CD-ROM, because I haven't got to looking at that yet. Let's put it all back together and let's fire it up. And then this, the real icing on the cake, happened. Take a look at this. Yes, I booted up my Amiga, painstakingly built from scratch, a brand new Amiga, and it booted as an Atari ST. Yes, I'll say that again. It booted as an Atari ST. And this wasn't a one-off. Every time I turned it on, my new Amiga was an Atari. What the hell was going on? So the only thing I could do was take a picture and go to my Discord chat room and say, guys, I'm having the day from hell, and this has just happened. And yeah, after much hilarity, if we go back to that scene, and if we zoom and enhance, you can see that my OSSC upscaler is sat on my joystick. It turns out this is a Vampire feature. Hold fire on boot to get an Atari ST, the feature Amiga owners always wanted. I just turned the lights off and went home after that, in the knowledge that, okay, at least my Amiga hasn't turned into an Atari, and we can get back to the problem of fixing the CD-ROM drive, which we've done now. So let me take the lid off, having got that day out the way, and show you the final form of what's inside here, how it's all configured, and then showcase the machine, and we can really stretch its legs and see how powerful it is, and also how it copes with those traditional programs and how compatible it is, and if we've got the right balance here. Let's take a look. So to recap, this build is based on that lovely purple board down there, the A500++ board by Rob Taylor, and it's in the Checkmate 1500 Plus case. We're using the optional Zorro extender card here, which comes as an option with the Checkmate case, and that takes power from the PSU and feeds it into our A500, so we don't need to use an external power brick. So that's how it's all being powered. And the CD-ROM over here is a slimline SATA with an adapter to make it a full-size SATA, which is then going through the cheapest of the cheap SATA to IDE converters, which has the jumper set to make it a slave device. That then is going from a 40-pin IDE to a 44-pin IDE adapter, which in turn goes to a dual channel cable into the Vampire IDE. And these are all adapters that you saw in the last episode, but the key to getting this working was not the adapters, it was not the cables, we had them all correct. It was upgrading the kickstart from 3.1, which comes in the Vampire, to 3.14. As soon as I did that, everything came to life. On the other channel, we have our SD card reader, which is acting as a hard drive, and you'll see I've jumped 2 wires to it, one to pin 1 and one to pin 39 of the IDE port on this, 39 being the activity pin. That's going to the hard drive light at the front of the case, so our hard drive activity light now actually flashes and we can see when data is being read. So that's a really nice hack. If you're thinking of doing this yourself, if you use the same board, great. If you don't, you may need to use a resistor just to make sure that you don't send too much power to the light at the front there and blow it up. But yeah, you can look into that. We have, of course, got the Vampire expansion. You saw that in the last episode, but we've added in this episode a floppy drive. And the reason I decided to add a floppy drive is because I'd quite like to use this machine to rip floppy disks and create ADF files easily, which you can do on pretty standard Amigas. But by adding something else, another cable here, which I need to fit a little more neatly, but there is an Ethernet header on the Vampire. So we've got an Ethernet port added, it's just hanging out the back here, and we'll demonstrate that today. So by being able to rip ADFs and then squirt them over Ethernet very easily into my local FTP server, this is a really nice archival machine to archive off any rare or unusual floppy disks I may have. In the CIA socket at the back here, of course, we have the USB adapter, so we can use a modern USB keyboard. And yes, we need to talk about my cable management. I know it looks terrible, but we have got some quite ungainly adapters on adapters on adapters over here. We've got the big old IDE cables, and we need to consider not only cable management, but things like the SD card adapter. We don't want it hitting the case and shorting out. We need things to kind of float in the right place so that they don't cause problems. So this is a balance, and we don't need to worry about airflow. Everything's passively cooled, so this is how it's going to stay. I don't know that you'll like it. It's not pretty, but I think it's a fair compromise. Those then are the finishing touches to complete the build to its current state, to a state that I'm very happy with. You know how these things go. There's always one more thing you're thinking of adding. There's always more upgrades that are possible, and no doubt I will play with this again in future. But for now, it's at a very good standard, a standard that I'm very happy with. So I think we'll connect it up to the capture system and show you exactly what the Checkmate Vampire A500++ Purple Beast Turbo is capable of. So I confess, I think this is a lovely looking machine, but let's keep our feet on the ground. It's still an Amiga 500 with a very fast CPU bolted on. It's not a modern PC, so we'll keep our expectations tied to what the original A500 was capable of and not if it can become our main desktop PC. We'll start with what we're familiar with, and that's the classic games. WHD Load is configured on the default Coffin OS image. That's a pre-packaged version of Workbench 3.9 with all the bells and whistles added. And it's available from Apollo. You can find a link in the description. Apollo claimed that while being very fast, the Vampire is completely code compatible with the 68000. And my experience this week has been very positive. Everything I've thrown at it seems to work, with the exception of a few games which run too quickly to be playable, and in those situations you have the option to enable Turtle Mode. This reduces the speed, but not all the way back to the A500 7 MHz as you might expect. If I enable it here and then rerun the benchmark, you can see that it's more akin to a stock Amiga 3000 than an A500, which would have been a nice option to have. But speed is what we have in abundance with this thing, so of course, I know you all want to see Frontier Elite 2 running the standard 3D test for Amigas it seems, and Brabant's Space Epic is as smooth as a hot knife cutting through intergalactic butter. All 3D games benefit from the power boost, of course. Here's Archer McLean's Pool, which is lovely and smooth, and it's let down only by what feels like a very dated control interface when compared to later simulations of the game. Raw speed of course makes games more playable, but it doesn't elevate them to greatness alone. An improved frame rate on F-18 Interceptor, for example, serves to highlight the simplicity of the flight model. To coin a term from Top Gun, the frame rate is writing checks the flight model's ego can't cash. It feels very clunky when you tap the throttle down too low on final approach to the carrier and suddenly you just fall like a brick out of the sky instead of diving into a more gradual stall. However, it's not all about the 3D games. This isn't a PlayStation. On the whole, this presents a nice quick way to explore the classic Amiga games library with little to report back on in terms of compatibility issues. Because of the way the Vampire outputs RTG or retargetable graphics through the HDMI port, we get a very modern looking high resolution display. It's really very impressive and it makes Workbench look thoroughly modern at these high resolutions and with so many colours. Those classic games, however, will still output from the regular video port on the Amiga, so you either need a monitor with both HDMI and SCART inputs so you can flick between the two, or you want a CRT next to the system, which I really enjoy because that to me is how the old games are meant to be played. So if you've got the desk space, you really can enjoy the best of both worlds. When we quit the game on our CRT, we jump back to the nice high-resolution desktop on the HDMI output. Now, classic games are the very least I would expect to enjoy from my new system. What can I do with all of this power? Well, I once made a video on the channel called The Fastest Apple Mac is an Amiga, and that was an example of an Amiga 1200 with an 030 accelerator in it running as an Apple Mac. And a very impressive job it did of it too. If we use that same Apple Mac emulator, which is called Shapeshifter, in this system, well, we're on a whole new level of classic Mac performance. Alone in the Dark is a breeze at the highest resolution the game will allow us to run it at, and as Shapeshifter supports the whole range of graphics hardware, this is configured to use the retargetable graphics and go out through the HDMI output, so it is now by far the quickest and easiest to fire up classic Mac experience I have in the cave. And it opens up a library of applications and games including Duke Nukem 3D. I won't try an impression, I'll sound more like a farmer than Duke. You have LGR to watch for the cool impressions. When we measured the speed of our accelerated A1200, it came in at 6.5 times faster than the benchmark Apple Quadra 605 computer model. In this benchmarking software, the Quadra 605 is a 1.0 score. Our Vampire comes in at 63 times the speed. That's nearly 10 times faster than an 030 Amiga 1200 running the same emulator. That is seriously impressive. Accurate and speedy Mac emulation is of course possible because classic Macs also ran on a Motorola 68000 range of CPUs. A much tougher test is to emulate a different CPU altogether, and the Vampire does have a really good go at emulating an x86 PC using software alone. Remember, many bridge boards are available for the Amiga with anything up to a 586 CPU on it for PC compatibility. But it is still fun to see an Amiga having a go at it without that hardware to help it. I'd say we're achieving low 386 standard speeds, and it is a usable experience providing you stick to the right software. Just don't try and run Tomb Raider. I mean, it's impressive that it even runs, but yeah, the less said about the frame rate the better. And of course we did see the Amiga trolling me earlier when it booted as an Atari ST, and sure, that works too. Another 68,000 native machine that the Vampire can tackle with ease, even taking on Doom without a problem. This is all very nice, and it does give us a good idea of the power in our new Amiga, but what can it do natively without mimicking other systems? What's new? Well, yes, that Workbench setup does look very attractive, and we can do a few things that are taken for granted these days, but impossible on stock Amigas, like playing MP3s or decompressing a video at a decent resolution. The real fun, though, comes with some of the native applications which can support our HDMI video mode and embrace the extra power. You saw Doom running on the Atari emulator, and sure, that runs great here on our Amiga. But how about some Quake? Seeing Quake here reminds me perhaps of the performance of a lower-end Pentium CPU, which in the context of an Amiga 500 is pretty cool. And there are a range of other games bundled with Coffin OS which allow us to demonstrate what this is capable of, so here's a quick montage to give you an idea.
locked.
A selection of games there, and some of the demos which require more powerful hardware than stock Amigas. So as I said earlier, I'm not going to pretend that this is a modern machine. It's a classic car with a rocket strapped to it, but taking it online shouldn't be beyond its capabilities, and we have a couple of ways of doing that. The Plip Box is a little device that might interest you. This one is from Simulant, and links are in the description. It plugs into the back of any Amiga to offer you network connectivity. So that's certainly an option to existing owners, but as we have a Vampire in here, there is that header which I showed you earlier into which we've plugged an Ethernet adapter. In Coffin OS is then simply a case of clicking on the network wizard and selecting our device, and you can also see that the Plip Box is listed in there, so that can be just as easily configured. Within a few clicks it automatically picks up an IP address using DHCP and we're online. Now there is an Amiga web browser, here's iBrowse, and the experience of browsing the web on an Amiga on what is a very outdated web browser is exactly as you would expect. There are a lot of compatibility problems, and if you stray far from the Amiga forums and Amiga specific websites, you really are going to start to struggle. Don't even think about trying to watch a video on YouTube. But being online is about more than just the World Wide Web, and the most useful thing about having this online is FTP access. I can quickly connect to my local FTP server to transmit files to the machine or one of the dedicated Amiga FTP servers out there online, and explore a huge library of music, mods, games, or everything and anything really that ever appeared on the Amiga. The community has done a great job of archiving the software library and getting it online and available to us. So in short, using this machine to get online is really quite simple, and it's well worth doing. Speaking of archives, that was one of the reasons I wanted the CD-ROM drive to be working, so that I could explore my old public domain software CDs, and after a lot of head scratching we did get that CD drive working. The key, as I mentioned earlier, was to update Kickstart from 3.1 to 3.1.4. As soon as I flashed Kickstart 3.1.4 to the Vampire, the CD drive sprang to life. And if you're thinking of doing this yourself, there are two commands with the Vampire to try. One boots into the Kickstart ROM as part of the startup sequence, so this is a soft kick if you like, and I recommend that you do that first to check that your ROM works okay and you're not going to run into any issues. Because if you then use the second command to actually flash the Kickstart to the Vampire, well, you do risk bricking the whole thing because you've flashed a file that doesn't work onto it, so do the soft kick first. With that done, the CD drive showed up in the HD toolbox. That's a tool in Workbench to detect hard drives and CD drives and the like, and then I used a tool called IDE Fix to complete the installation. Now I can pop in CDs like Hottest 4 Professional here and dig through archives of public domain software, finding things like this folder full of mod files that we can fire up from the CD. How thoroughly modern. There is one disadvantage to running the CD on the same IDE port as your hard drive, and that's that it slows down the overall speed of access. We have a choice of speed settings here with the Vampire, so if you're using an SD card or Compact Flash as the only device on the channel, then you can really ramp up the speed, and in future I may have a play with putting the CD drive onto its own IDE card in the Zorro slot, but honestly, it's still plenty fast enough at accessing data even on the slowest setting. I don't think you'll be disappointed even if you can't use the high speed. Now another thing I wanted to use this for is to archive floppy disks before they rot away. The easiest way I've found of doing this is with some software called ADFer, which you can find at robthenerd.com. This can run on pretty much any Amiga. It doesn't need all of this power at all, but I wanted to show you it anyway because, well, it's something I've been doing a lot of since I built this machine. And what makes it so convenient is that network connectivity. So I can upload it straight into my file server or an online archive. It's nice to try and do your bit to keep this data preserved. Those are just a few of the things I've tried in the short time since I built this machine, in the space of about a week. I feel like I've still got a lot more to discover and a lot more that I want to show you, so here's another quick montage of software running on the machine, and then I'll give you my conclusion. And so that wraps up the build, but no doubt it only marks the start of my time tweaking, upgrading and playing with this. What a baseline system it is. It's by far the most impressive OCS ECS Amiga in my collection, and it's going to get a lot of use. And it's been hugely satisfying to build it from scratch. I hope you've enjoyed the series throughout, from the basic board to what we have now. In a way, it's also given me a strange insight into what it must have been like to be an Amiga owner through the 90s. I abandoned ship in the early 90s and went to the PC. And in order to demonstrate this power, I've had to use things like an Apple Mac emulator, because development basically fell off a cliff on the Amiga. Developers abandoned ship and moved to other platforms. So to get a slightly more modern word processor or games like Duke Nukem at that period, you could only really do it through an emulator. And time will now tell whether developments like the Vampire board and the community that surrounds it will bring to systems like this new ports of perhaps open source Office applications, brand new games that can make use of the power, and anything else besides. It'll be really interesting to find out. But in the meantime, I'll certainly be exploring the classic library and seeing what new experiences this extra power can bring to those old programs. I really hope you've enjoyed the series. Everything you need to know about everything that's gone into this system is in the video description, so go and have a look, and do let me know if you take on board these projects. I know Rob has sold quite a few of the A500++ boards now, so message me on Twitter or in my Discord and let me know about your own projects. Until then, and until the next video, take care and see you soon.